My name's Tom Eisman. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I'll be moderating this next session on identifying contextual water targets through knowledge co-production. In the past few years, there's been a significant shift in corporate water strategy. Instead of water resilience as something that's a nice to have or an afterthought, companies have realized that failing to manage water-related risks is a threat to their ongoing viability in business operations. And this has expanded corporate interest beyond just managing water use in their facilities to look at water management throughout their supply chains, and particularly in their supply base. So for food and beverage companies, that means the farms that are growing their raw ingredients. The question is, how do you improve the water resilience of a distributed network of farms all over the world? For companies like Cargill, who source from thousands of basins worldwide, this is a real challenge. Or to put a finer point on it, you can't manage what you don't measure. And measurement, until very recently, was incredibly hard to do. And as we heard in the last session, even still, measurement is a vexing challenge. But fortunately, there are new tools to assist with this challenge, a notable example being the Aqueduct dataset, which was published by the World Resources Institute. But the challenge is figuring out how do you use these global scale tools so that corporations can start investing in the basins with the highest positive impact on the water resilience in their supply chains. In this presentation, we'll hear from Cargill and the Nature Conservancy about how this new tool is being used and expanded upon to identify and ameliorate water risk in Cargill's supply chains. The learning objectives of this session are to convey the challenge and necessity of prioritizing corporate water interventions and the role of different types of knowledge, from global data sets to local natural resource experts and managers in doing so. So our panel today includes Taryn Barkley, the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at Cargill, Jacob Fritton, the Director of Agriculture for the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska, and Hannah Berger, the Senior Agricultural Scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Corporate Engagement Team. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Hannah.
All right. So first, instructions for all of you. Is to pull out your phone or your laptop computer and go to menti.com and enter the code 4408-8856. It's also on the sheet in front of you, first page. You do not have to download an app. It's just on the web browser. For those who are watching in remotely, I think that the link should be available to you as well. If you're having trouble, we'll float around a little bit later to help you get started and make sure that you're logged in. What we're going to do is present a summary, some background information, and then we're going to challenge all of you to give us some feedback and some ideas. So crowdsourcing some ideas based on the information provided. So the first part of the presentation will be giving you the relevant context you need, and then about a third or halfway through is when we're going to sort of solicit feedback from you all, and there'll be a lot more instructions, including in this packet, which you do not need to open yet, but this is the information you'll use a little bit later. So with that, you have your instructions. I'm going to pass it to Taryn.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and thanks very much for having me here today. I'm Taryn Barkley. I'm part of our corporate responsibility team at Cargill. I support a number of our partnerships that help advance our sustainability priorities and goals. And here today to give you a little bit of background onto our corporate water approach. So for those of you that may not be familiar with Cargill, we're a global food, agriculture, and industrial company operating in 70 countries around the world with 155,000 employees. Our purpose is to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. We connect farmers with markets, customers with the ingredients they need, and people and animals with food and feed ingredients. We combine our experience with new technologies and insights to serve as a trusted partner for food, agricultural, financial, and industrial customers. Our sustainability strategy at Cargill encompasses 3 priority areas: climate, land and water, and people, which includes our approach to farmer livelihoods and human rights. Each of these areas has a clearly defined approach and strategy to advance sustainable and resilient supply chains. We know that we want to build a food and agricultural system of the future that can respond to the challenges, if we think about things like water, but also we believe that agriculture can bring many solutions to these challenges too. And this is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. We know that water is a critical resource in agriculture, and Cargill has an important leadership role to play in advancing these solutions to work across our value chain in protecting and enhancing water resources. Our water strategy prioritizes action where it's most needed, based on the specific water challenges faced by the local community and watershed. And I was really interested in the plenary session this morning that there was a lot of discussion actually about thinking about the local context and how important that is. So Cargill is one of the first companies to set contextual water targets across the value chain. That's why our approach is so unique, because we don't just think about our operational footprint, but also the supply chain and communities where we operate. Our global ambition for water is about enabling that positive impact across those operations, supply chains, and communities. We've set clear goals, which are about implementing a water stewardship approach across our 70 priority facilities. We're also working in our supply chain to both support improved water quality, but also address vital issues of availability. And we've set some metric targets, which you can see on the screen. We also think about the work that we can do in our communities. There we go. And we really want to think about how we can enable improved access to safe drinking water in many of those places where that's really an issue. This approach guides how we bring together stakeholders, including farmers, ranchers, NGOs, customers, and local communities, because we want to find those local solutions to those water issues. The discussion this morning around the role of collaboration and partnership is so critical. We need to work across the supply chain to bring those solutions and bring those people together. This allows us to tackle water and climate resiliency while improving the use of those natural resources. I think many of these topics are so interconnected. So how we think about working with farmers to improve practices around soil health might also improve that water management. And how can we think about bringing different technologies, solution, practices, as well as research and knowledge to really help deliver on our goals and support that better management of those critical natural resources. So I'm really proud of the work that Cargill has done. We're going to talk a little bit about the sort of journey that we went on to develop these methodologies. It was a collaboration that we did with, as Tom mentioned, with the World Resources Institute. And we really used a three-step approach to direct this process. We assessed our impact and dependencies across the value chain to really prioritize the most important activities. We thought about how we could prioritize locations around those three areas, that water availability, water quality, and access, and then setting targets that would really help to address those critical issues within that context. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the details of how we put that together, but certainly happy to be part of this discussion and talk a bit more about our approach.
Lots of microphones up here. Thank you so much, Taryn. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, the context that Taryn shared and also what Tom mentioned, which is measurement. While it has improved, it's still a vexing challenge, and you can't manage what you don't measure. So first, why are we measuring this? Well, we want water resilient supply chains, and we need to define what that means. Water resilient supply chains to us, the first for many areas is stable agricultural production. So this means despite vagaries in water availability, precipitation, and local conditions, farmers and producers are adaptive, they're flexible, they're resilient to sort of changes in moisture. We also talk about efficient production on healthy soils, and this is really about water quality. Agricultural resilience relies on maximizing nutrient use efficiency, input use efficiency on soils that are using soil health practices. And so these first two are really talking about scarcity, managing for water scarcity, and managing to improve water quality. But we also have really important social considerations. And so the next is healthy communities. And these are communities are water resilient when they have options and opportunities to control their fate. And this concept of quote unquote fate control is something from the public health literature. And it really says that communities are resilient and healthy when they have not only options to choose among to control their fate, but the ability to distinguish among them. And then finally, effective governance controls. This is especially important for water scarcity. But when you have effective governance controls, you can manage water resources at a watershed level, and that's often really important when we're talking about managing for water scarcity. And so now that we know what these supply chains are, okay, how do we actually achieve them? We have two sort of how slides. And the first, I'm going to talk a little bit about constraints and considerations. And so the first, for many of us working in this space, is we want to embed water resilience into core business operations. As Tom mentioned and Taryn mentioned, this is no longer about, a nice to have, trying to be a good global steward. What we really want to see from corporations is embedding water resilience into the way they make their decisions. And so this means instead of a sustainability team working on enterprise targets and a procurement team working on procuring raw ingredients, it's embedding sustainability in procurement decisions. That's really how we see this scale, and we make sure that what we're doing is, integrating and changing the way businesses do their work, because with that, it's really a wonderful way to achieve scale. One of the challenges nested in that, though, is what is the requisite data? Because I'm not a procurement expert, I'm a sustainability scientist. And so what you need to do is figure out how to have those collaborative conversations with the folks who are making those decisions about procurement. And that can be really challenging, it's really exciting, but those are the collaborations that we're still sort of in our early days with. The next is measurement and reporting. So this is, again, one of the really interesting but also kind of tricky and wicked problems, which is we want to be able to track and monitor increases in resilience. And what that means for each location is going to be very dependent on the local conditions, the sociology, the hydrology, the environmental conditions, the economics, et cetera. But we also want to make sure those roll up so that a company like Cargill can say, here's our global target, this is how we want to increase our resilience, and they can actually measure that. And so there's this real challenge of making sure that the way we measure things are both locally specific, but also roll up into some sort of general, easy to state metric. And then finally, one of the other major challenges here, it's also really exciting, is that a lot of companies have set public water targets. If you go on their websites, you can look at other sort of disclosure operations. You'll see that a lot of companies have really ambitious goals, and those are on a short timeline, and they have limited budgets and time to get those achieved. And so it's really important that we figure out how to prioritize. If you have a limited amount of time and resources to get your supply chains resilient, you have to put those in the places where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. And that's really where another one of the major measurement challenges comes in. So Taryn mentioned this, but I'm going to put it up again. The other how, which is contextual water targets, and this is sort of a dry term that companies are using across the industry. And what it really means is put the interventions where they're going to give you the most benefit and that are specific to the local conditions. And so when we think about how a company would go about this, there are three sort of major ingredients that go into that process for setting contextual water targets. And the first is sourcing importance. So a company is going to focus on the places where they source their raw ingredients from. Sometimes you'll see companies sourcing from a larger region where there might be major water challenges, and I think that's something we want to encourage. But again, when we think about scaling these up, it's really about figuring out how to embed those resilience decisions into procurement. And when we talk about procurement, those touch down in very specific places. And so we really want to focus on the areas that are most important to a company's procurement. The second is use of global open source databases. Tom mentioned this before, I'm going to show it on the next slide, but until very recently, it was really hard to come up with a consistent way to measure where water risk was spatially and temporally across the world. And now we have some really great early tools that are really changing how we do this. And then the third, and this is sort of where my personal academic expertise is and where we're going to focus the second part of this presentation, is complementing with local expert input. So this means taking those ingredients from 1 and 2 and then going to the ground or going to someone who has local expertise and saying, does this make sense to you? What's needed? What's already going on? How can we support and amplify existing efforts? Here's that sort of global database I was telling you about. So if you go to aqueduct.com, it's still in beta, but we're already using it in a lot of our analyses of corporate water risk for various companies we work with. Apologies that the font is a little bit small and probably hard to read, but this quick snapshot, what we chose was overall water risk, and this is the risk metric we're going to be focusing on throughout this presentation when you see different sort of heat maps. And the darker the color, the higher the risk. The lighter and cooler the color, the lower the risk. And this risk is a composite score that has about 12 different metrics embedded, all the way from water scarcity, coastal eutrophication potential, which is a nice proxy for water quality, all the way through environmental, social, governance risk factors. So it's a really beautiful, all-encompassing metric. And you can also sort of unclick it and sort of get all those component subparts as well and look at those in isolation. If you're good with accessing data sets, you can actually find the risk scores for all of these basins and download it and use it in your own analyses. I'm not one of those people, but there are folks on my team who are already using these databases. So big shout out to World Resources Institute for this amazing resource. Cargill and WRI teamed up to sort of think about how that global resource is going to apply to some of the work they do. And there are a few quotes that I want to bring your attention to that I think are relevant. And so the first is directly from this document, or this report that you can also find online. And to set robust contextual water targets, ideally one would have full transparency across the value chain. In reality, data gaps are plentiful. And those data gaps are really what we're going to focus on today. How do we fill those in a way that is efficient and effective and allows us to move forward with a modicum of confidence where we can start making recommendations for interventions? But first, we're going to focus on what this global model looks like for a couple dummy watersheds that we've pulled up. So applying global models and data sets like Aqueduct can facilitate an efficient and scalable method across large portfolios using globally comparable data. So the key here is that you can compare water risk in basins in the middle of Nebraska and South Africa and make sort of more informed decisions. So here's our case study, and now we're about to sort of lead up into the audience elicitation. So some of the slides I'm about to present are also in here. Jacob's gonna run our audience elicitation and he'll walk you through that. I know there are some folks who trickled in. We'll make sure you have these packets before the audience elicitation starts. So, the first is our study area. I wanna note that these are not specific to Cargill. We just grabbed them off of the Aqueduct data set, and we also know that there are important agricultural sourcing zones worldwide. So on the left, you see a handful of basins. These are about Hydro Basin 6 or Huck 8 in central Nebraska. And then you see on the right column a couple basins in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Africa, excuse me. And so these are going to be sort of our case study basins. We're going to focus on 2 basins in Nebraska and 2 basins in South Africa. I know there are more than 2 in each, but it'll become clear because we've actually interviewed folks in some of these, and so for anonymity purposes, we didn't want folks to be able to link some of those replies to the specific basins. So just know that there are 2 basins from each of those locations that we're really focused on. All right, so here are some of the results from that top-down global approach. I want to draw your attention first to the maps on the left, and so those are the 4 basins in Nebraska and 3 basins in South Africa that are our study area we just presented. And as I showed in the WRI Aqueduct slide about 3 slides ago, the warmer and darker the colors, the higher the water risk. The lighter and cooler, the lower the water risk. Again, this water risk is a composite of 12 individual water risk scores. The way that Aqueduct has grouped these is into these categories at the top of the slide: low, which is the lightest yellow, low medium, medium high, high, extremely high. So these quintiles are what we're gonna follow. Again, these are composite scores, and so we don't necessarily need to know the underlying sort of numbers that define them. But you will see at first glance that the water risk looks really different between the Nebraska and South Africa context. So now we have a pretty wordy table. There we go. So this is also in your handout. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because you can read it at your own time. And again, I know the folks who trickled in will get you those handouts here in a minute. But what I really want to draw your attention to is that we have Nebraska Basin A and Basin B at the top. their overall water risk from that Aqueduct data set is medium high. And that's attributed to some mix of water risk scarcity and water quality scarcity. But what's important here is if you look at that last column of sourcing importance, they are high and extremely high for this dummy company's sourcing. If you look at the South Africa, basins A and B, the water risk is higher. So that it's high and extremely high. But if you look at sourcing importance, it's medium and low. So what you have here are basins with slightly lower water risk, but more sourcing importance, and much more water risk, but lower sourcing importance. And with that, I'm gonna pass it to, whoa. Yeah, got a little zesty. It's really excited about audience solicitation. All right, so I'm gonna pass it to Jacob. I'm gonna be floating around, and if folks could just raise their hands if they don't have handouts, then I'll make sure to get them in your hands.
Jacob from the Nature Conservancy here in Nebraska. I'm going to double down on Hannah. Is everybody, by show of hands, who's been able to log into the Mentimeter tool? Okay. If you need help getting in there, I'm assuming Hannah would be able to help you out there as well too. So this exercise here, essentially what we're asking you to do is we want to hire you as a consultant by a company to help recommend interventions with a budget of $1 million overall across 4 basins. The intervention should be prioritized for both sourcing importance and water risk. The intervention should address the water challenge specific to the location, and the ideal outcomes will include both local direct benefits and the potential scale to both enterprise scale targets and into actionable insights to procurement teams. Okay. Are you ready to throw up the? You guys can hear me okay without the mic? Yeah, they need the online stuff. Okay. So you all have the last 2 slides that Hannah had presented to lean into. And Hannah's going to pull up the Mentimeter now here. Good to go. Okay. Are you triggering the first one to be asked? Or how's it work here? Just 1 second.
You can just start going, Jacob.
Okay. So the first question, what's the first question on there? I don't have it in front of me, Hannah. This was ranking. Okay. All right, so what we need to do is run into, if you open up your app, you should be able to go through, and there'll be a drop-down menu. But essentially, we want you to go through and rank the basin features in order of importance when you're making your recommendation. We're good? Okay. Okay. And so you're ranking this on sourcing importance, the overall water risk, water scarcity risk, and water quality risk. We'll give it a couple minutes for answers to filter in. I didn't even vote. Yes.
Are we ranking all 4 here or just one?
All 4 basins together.
Okay.
As you put them in, the next one comes up, so you can do it more.
Are there any other questions? bars are bouncing around a little bit, so there must be people submitting.
I have
Yeah.
a question.
Sure.
I don't know if it matters actually to how I was doing the exercise, but are they all sourcing the same thing?
Great question. I'm going to assume yes.
I assume yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I should've said
These are their options.
Which one?
I wasn't sure if you gave, I was with this.
The
You did
question.
this and this.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Good
that's why they're
question.
confused.
This isn't on a slide, though. Okay.
Good question.
I'm going to give you some extra context here as well, too. If you move in your packet to the second to last page, hold off on the last page, that's for later. But if you look at that page, it gives you several different options for approaches. It goes through, gives a description, overall costs, and a couple of the factors of how it impacts things. But the gist of what we have here, this collaborative innovation project for water quality, that's where you're teaming up with local entities to co-create a program to address the water challenges. A collaborative intervention project for water quantity, same thing, just focused on the water quantity challenges. Looking at doing a grant for existing programs, so just helping to support something that's on the ground already. Creating a new program that would be run specifically by the company. And then finally, using some money to conduct some more research. Do we have what we need on that first slide to move forward?
Yep.
Okay. So with that context of the 5 different project designs that you could take, go through and rank those based upon cost, direct impact, and the scalability to both the enterprise targets and to procurement.
And if folks want clarification or context, just raise your hand and we can just add more. If you have a question as well, probably good.
I guess just a clarification, can you clarify the difference between the links to enterprise targets and translatable procurement?
So the question here was, what's the difference between scalability linked to enterprise targets and scalability translation to procurement? And this is something that we actually contend with quite a bit when we're working with companies. And so the first is, companies will have those enterprise water targets. They want to be able to show progress. And so the projects will be designed around ensuring those outcomes can be measured and reported at that enterprise global scale. But there's another challenge, which is we also want to translate those results into something like a procurement decision. And those aren't always the same. So those are 2 really important scaling, quote unquote, mechanisms for our work, is both being able to report at the enterprise scale and also empower procurement teams to include these data into their decision making. And so sometimes they overlap, but they are separate enough we decided to split them up here.
Is it what you were expecting, Taryn?
No, it's super interesting to get everyone's perspective on how you do this ranking.
Okay, Hannah, looks like we got 23 folks through. Okay, on this last prompt, it's just text field for you to be able to put your thoughts in. But what we're looking for is based on the information you have, what recommendations would you give to the company? something. Okay. If you're looking for what to lean into for content on this, look at the second to last page. The final page is going to be coming up here in a minute. This feels a lot like school. We'll give this a couple minutes for folks to get their information in there. And when it's done, we'll populate the screen with people's inputs. Okay, we got 10 responses. I think we're going to throw up on the screen. I'm going to try to poke around in the audience and see if anybody is willing to speak up for their answer. Oh, there's a lot there. Okay, I'm going to randomly pick one. Team up with a local entity to co-create a local program. Does anybody want to claim that piece? Everybody's shy. I'll roll with another one. Let's see. Perform collaborative intervention project for water quality and give grants to existing projects. Anybody want to highlight why they picked that one? You own that one?
Do I need to use the mic?
Sure.
Hi, these are my first moments with all of you. I'm a plant breeder, and I'm thinking about sustainability within that context. But I was looking at the $1 million budget and then eyeballed where the impacts were, and I thought that the water quality seemed to be the one that was weighted the heaviest. And I think in any case, you should always try to support the local programs because that's where you get your buy-in. It happens at the breakfast counter when you have growers together and they're the buddy they admire down the road, he's the influencer, and so he's where you'll get adoption.
Thank you. I think we can probably grab two more. Does anybody want to raise their hand and give thoughts on their specific one before we pick one off the screen? Yes, sir. Let me get you the microphone. Thanks.
very echoey. Can you hear me without this? No. Okay. All right, I'm sorry. So I think it was really hard to do this without knowing the root causes in each basin. And that's why I answered the one on the right there about starting with procurement and local people on the ground who work with growers, because in my mind, it really depends on what's needed in that area. So I had a really difficult time trying to come up with some suggestions. I've worked with growers before, and it's extremely difficult in what's needed on the ground. Let's say for a water quality issue, it depends on what is the cause of that, and maybe it's runoff, maybe it's lack of municipal or industrial treatment. So it was hard for me to be specific on this.
Thank you. I think we got time for one more. If somebody wants to, that's a quick hand.
Throughout the land. No, okay, so I'm wondering if there are multiple grants to existing local programs. It's weird. Could you get scalability? Yeah.
I don't know that I necessarily have the question is if you have multiple partners within the same geography? Was that the question, or did I misunderstand?
Yes, because it's cheaper to do the grant to existing local programs. So if you have $1 million, maybe you could it's a lower cost to do grants to existing local programs. So maybe if you do 5 of them, you could get scalability. Maybe.
Has anybody got thoughts on that, Taryn or Hannah?
We'll address it.
Well, it sounds like we're going to address it as we move forward. Okay, so some of you alluded to this already. Similar sort of thing, we'll give it a couple minutes, but what information could you add to this that would help you to make your recommendation? This should be the next prompt within Mentimeter. Okay, I'm going to Did I lose the microphone? Did it work again? Okay. How scalability is achieved, what sources of problems and feasible solutions, examples, what is causing water quality problems in each location, are local producers, agencies willing to collaborate, Have any similar projects failed in the past, and what reasons for each location? Actual basins info on the challenges and their causes. Information about local economy, culture, major water risk, current perceptions of company. Information about specific areas, their crops, the water availability and quality, desired outcomes if available. Local farmer voices. Basin-specific data. Sounds like a lot of stuff kind of digging more into better resolution of information. Okay. I'm going to hand it back over to Hannah.
All right, thank you everybody so far. Just keep going. Oh God, it's muted in the room. Beautiful. Apologies for the weird echo. It's because we're in a small room. This is Nick Brozovich's conference, and so if you have problems, just talk to him. Just kidding. But now they can hear it. We have to use the microphones. They can hear us online, but hopefully we'll just project because we're muted in the room now. So this should be a little bit easier. All right, so the goal of that, well, first of all, thank you for bearing with us. This is the first time we've done this with paper printouts in a room like this. But the goal was to try to make folks make decisions even though you're in conditions of high uncertainty, right? There's a lot of information missing. Sorry. So I'm going to go back to this quote from this WRI, World Resources Institute report, and talk about these data gaps. And so the exercise we just did was focusing on filling those data gaps using that top-down approach with high, medium, and low, and then giving you some options. Now we're going to fill those data gaps with some local context. So this general approach, the general framework that we like to use is called knowledge co-production. There are a lot of different definitions for this. Knowledge co-production is a tool that's been used quite a bit, especially in sort of contexts like small-scale fisheries management. A lot of indigenous communities use this to work with Western researchers, to sort of talk about resilience and health. And we're seeing it increasingly applied to sort of more mainstream, tricky issues like water management. And so knowledge co-production is an iterative and collaborative process that brings together multiple ways of knowing to uncover paths forward towards more resilient and healthy communities of people and nature. And there are 4 major features that I want to call out today. The first is context-based. And so we have to make sure that anytime we're doing knowledge co-production, we've clearly defined what the context is, what the challenge is, and what the objective is. It's pluralistic, so multiple ways of knowing are included. It's important that we don't say integrated or leverage, because historically Western scientific knowledge was the predominant way of knowing, and what we want to do is bring together multiple ways of knowing without comparing and saying one is proving or improving on the other. This is really about, again, pluralistic, multiple ways of knowing and bringing them together in sort of a respectful and harmonious way to uncover different ways of knowing. It's goal-oriented, and so it's really important that everyone aligns on the shared goal. If you leverage multiple ways of knowing and folks don't know why they're giving you their knowledge, then you're not actually doing ethical and effective knowledge co-production. And finally, it's interactive. So when you're doing knowledge co-production, you are sharing, you're hearing, you're sharing, you're hearing, and you iterate and iterate to make sure that initial sort of assumptions that folks might have are shared, or if they're not shared, they're clarified and redefined. The way that I like to use knowledge co-production, the sort of different ways of knowing, is through something I like to call expert elicitation. And this is something, again, that is used often in natural resources management. It's a concept often in statistics. I'm using the less quantitative and statistical approach here. But in general, expert elicitation is going and soliciting experts' point of view or perspectives on a specific issue, again, is that one way of knowing. Traditionally, in the more statistical approach, you actually will ask experts, like climatologists, for instance, you'll have them give you probabilities and probability distribution functions to talk about sort of the likelihood of an event occurring. In this context, we're not asking folks to give probabilities. So if you're an expert in this, just know that instead we went sort of the narrative route. And so we asked folks for qualitative information about local conditions. There are 4 major components of ethical expert elicitation. The first is expertise, and so you want to make sure that folks have the relevant expertise to answer and contribute their knowledge. That one's pretty straightforward. The second is a structured approach. So if you're doing qualitative surveys, if you're doing quantitative surveys, making sure that it's very rigorous and replicable approach. The next is transparency, and so anytime you're eliciting expert information, you have to be extremely clear about the process, how the information is being used, and then also depending on the context, especially if you're working with more marginalized communities, like indigenous communities or tribes in the Amazon, for instance, where TNC does quite a bit of work, it's important to have an anonymous complaint mechanism, so if folks feel like their information is being used inappropriately or ineffectually, there's recourse that they have as well. And then finally, flexibility. Oftentimes as you uncover information, the objective could change. And so again, this is back to that iteration and making sure that you're adjusting and adapting as time goes forward. So those two concepts, the knowledge co-production and expert elicitation, are more of these academic sort of overall framings that I wanted to provide before I actually start sharing some results from an expert elicitation investigation that we did. So we reached out to 2 of these 4, I won't tell you which ones for anonymity purposes, basins in central Nebraska, and we elicited expert input. For those who are Nebraskans, we reached out to folks who worked for natural resources, 2 of the 4 natural resource districts shown here. We had general conversation prompts in addition to explaining why we were gathering the information. We sort of said these are the areas we really wanted you to touch on. And so we had asked them about the major challenges in their basin, the solutions, their impact, the adoption rate of those solutions, how the private sector can support them, and what gives them hope. Before I jump into the results, I want to do a major caveat that we were really curious to know what the adoption rate and the impact of the best practices were in their basin, and neither one of them wanted to answer it, and they couldn't answer it in a lot of cases, which I think is a really important result. And so we're still going to ask this as we continue to sort of go from basin to basin, but the answers we got instead were really surprising, and so that's a good example of being flexible and iterative, and so we adjusted both conversations on the fly. Now, I apologize in advance for this next slide. It is very text heavy. This is also the last page of your handout. I don't want you to read it. You'll be able to read it in a minute, but what I really want to focus on are the differences between Nebraska Basin A and Basin B. So Nebraska Basin A, they told us that there are water quality and quantity issues, but really the major challenge for them is quantity. There's a lot of variability in rainfall, in agricultural practices, in surface and groundwater dynamics throughout that basin. As a result, it's really tricky to sort of manage those surface and groundwater resources in a coherent way. They also mentioned that there are many other players beyond just the Natural Resources District and farmers. There are also public power districts. There are Fish and Wildlife Service, a lot of other users that all have a vested interest in the outcomes of the system. And so managing that in a coherent way is one of their greatest challenges. Basin A also said that was one of the biggest solutions, so they're seeing a lot more collaborative water management. There are models, there's general agreement throughout the basin that folks are really interested in figuring out collaborative water management solutions. This was really interesting when we asked them, how are you going out and measuring like the rate of best practice adoption? And they said, we don't worry about that, we worry about outcomes. So we have certain triggers for water quality and water quantity, and if those triggers or if those thresholds are met, we have governance and legal triggers at our disposal to sort of impose either irrigation moratoriums. They can limit interbasin transfers. They can also limit where, when, and how much fertilizer is applied. And they do that based on their models that show where the biggest challenges come from. So again, in Nebraska Basin A, they don't worry about overall adoption rate. They say there are specific hotspots that are contributing to the challenges. Once thresholds are hit, we focus on those areas. We focus on adoption in those specific regions. So again, just an interesting aside that we're talking about this top-down, and even when you get to that basin level, they're talking about that top-down, bottom-up, right? Like scale matters at pretty much every level when it comes to water management, which is pretty cool. What gives them hope is the adaptability and resilience of their farmers. When they sort of impose those triggers or those mechanisms, farmers historically have been able to adjust. When farmers need a little additional support, there are a lot of sort of helpers in the region. There's the Natural Resources District, NRCS, and increasingly the private sector. And so when we asked them how the private sector can help, their answer was, when those changes have to be abrupt, those additional resources, training, and programs are really important, and they're especially important for farmers who might view those changes as more risky than other farmers and need a little additional support to de-risk those and give them a pathway to sort of more resilient water management. We asked them, what do you want a non-Nebraska audience to know? Maybe show of hands if folks are not from Nebraska in the room. Oh, wow, okay. I would say about half of folks raised their hands. This is great. They said, producers are the greatest conservationists they have. And they also said, hey, open door to all visitors. There are a lot of natural resources, lots of recreation opportunities. A really amazing sandhill crane migration comes through every March or so. And so they said, our doors are open, come visit us in one of these random NRGs in middle of Nebraska. All right, Nebraska Basin B, I'll spend a little less time on it because I'll be able to contrast to Nebraska Basin A. Nebraska Basin B said, our major challenge is water quality. We have some quantity concerns across the basin. There are some areas where recharge is lower, where water scarcity is a little bit more intense, but in general, we have adequate rainfall and we have triggers in place. And in the past, we've been able to use those triggers. Farmers are aware of them. Everyone knows that when water levels hit a certain level, these triggers are in place and folks are used to them. But they said when it comes to water quality, the horse got out of the barn. And they're really concerned and worried about this. They feel like some of those triggers that they have in place, farmers are incredibly resistant to. They also feel like a lot of the challenges are, I think they said something about, farmers in the 1950s applying 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we're seeing those challenges now. And so how do we convince folks now to try to clean up the challenges of their grandfather's generation? And so again, really concerned with water quality. Some of the solutions were really interesting from this stakeholder. So again, for Nebraska Basin B, excuse me. So they talked about some of the practices that we would think about: reducing your fertilizer inputs, installing riparian or edge of stream buffers. They also talked about the fact that they really had a lot of hot spots when it comes to water quality, and if you can focus your efforts on those hot spots, you can get a lot of work done. The other solution that was really interesting is they said, we've been beating the soil health drum for 10, 15 years, and farmers didn't really know what it meant. And then all of a sudden, people like Keith Burns, who owns a green cover seed, a cover crop sort of facility out in Bladen, Nebraska, started talking about soil health. And academics started talking about soil health. And people who are buying their grain and selling them inputs started talking about soil health. And they said it was that surround sound campaign that made guys go, hey, I actually am interested in this. And they came back to the NRG and said, hey, I want to do something with soil health. And so that was really actually kind of a fascinating, Jacob and I have worked in this area for about 5 or 6 years now, and it was really cool to hear them say like that it's the surround sound messaging coming from multiple angles that gives them a lot of hope. And they're hoping that soil health and can bleed into water quality, and that everyone can start talking about nutrient use efficiency as well. When it comes to how the private sector can help, they really hammered home that messaging. They also talked about de-risking practices, giving farmers an opportunity to try out new practices, but they were really focused on surround sound messaging. And in fact, we even straight up asked this Nebraska Basin B, like, do you need resources from the private sector, cash to get this done? And they say, we have all the cash we need right now. We can't spend it fast enough because we don't have any takers. What we really need is, again, that surround sound campaign, alignment and messaging. And they also said something really funny, which was, we're working at NRGs because we're science nerds, we're not salespeople. And what we really need are salespeople to go out and talk to farmers. And when we talked to them about, what about a salesperson who's buying grain from farmers who already knows how to sell things? And they said, yeah, that's what we need. So really interesting, 2 basins in central Nebraska, one of them more concerned with water quantity, feels like they have triggers in place, feels like they need some help to sort of get some of those farmers some capacity and de-risking opportunities to really integrate some water quantity measurement tools on their farms. And that Nebraska Basin B, which is much more about water quality and about messaging and alignment. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jacob.
Thank you. We'll give it a second here. Hannah's going to pull up our next prompts for the Mentimeter exercise.
Can I maybe add a comment in here? Just one thing that I want to echo is just a lot of, what I've heard today that's really reinforced the approach that Cargill takes is, really making sure that we consider that local context, and also taking a very kind of co-designed approach from stakeholders in that context. If I think about some of the programming we do, like from a water access perspective in many communities around the world, we really identify who are those local organizations, understanding the context, doing that work in those local communities, and really having that sort of community-centered, co-created approach. And that's really important, I think, in all contexts, that you're really bringing in different stakeholders who are part of that community and know what the challenges and solutions are.
Okay. So now that you have this additional information and all the stuff that Hannah gave you for extra findings from the local folks, how, if at all, would you update your initial recommendation? And on this, I'd say focus on just the two Nebraska basins. We didn't have time to get through the South Africa piece. We'll give this just a couple minutes. Okay. Feel free to wrap up your comment. It does save in here afterwards, I believe, as well, too. So if it doesn't make it in here right now, we'll still have plenty of time. I guess I'll start off by opening the forum. Anybody want to highlight or talk about what changes they made? If not, I'll go through the list and try to prompt some folks.
So a couple of things, so thank you first of all. A couple of things really jumped out from the findings. One is the emphasis on growers wanting to conserve. And that's the thing that those of us that spend time in the field, we hear that again and again. And so one thing that didn't come up in those interventions is really how you engage those voices that are in the community, how you hold up your local champion growers, because their voice is often much more compelling than certainly the academics' voice, the NGO's voice, or even the corporate voice. And so that would be a kind of a twist within those programs, how you identify. And for what it's worth, we actually have a number of those growers here at this conference, and we do engage with them often. But it's a thing that is very powerful. I'm not going to convince anybody to change anything, but a grower that is very, very good at what they do and is much more credible than I am.
Thank you, Nick. Anybody else? to have to pick on the kids in the back of the class and highlight somebody there. Let's see. Interdisciplinary socio-environmental research is needed to adapt, innovate existing local programs. Anybody want to expand upon that?
So my aim was that sometimes we can focus, like I'm a hydrologist and we just focus on the water and the quantity and the quality, but we lose focus on the social aspects of it, so like the stakeholders and so on. So my first initial recommendation was to fund local programs by conducting more research. But I think it's important to highlight that it needs to be a social environmental, like completely interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary research, that so that everybody involved, all the stakeholders, know the impact of all the aspects.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? You want another one, or? Dwayne, you keep getting pointed back. Got anything you want to contribute?
I have trouble filling this out because I'm sorry. We did this kind of the same thing back in Western Kansas. K-State Sociology actually interviewed 1,500 producers, and they all wanted to conserve, but they don't. It's hard to get buy-in when you have a property right with high or low commodity prices. That's what I'm saying. I try to spearhead something like this in Western Kansas. I had trouble coming up with the right idea. It was a water conservation project, and it failed. It's a tough engagement in farmer adoption and learning from your peers. I think that's how you scale it.
Thanks, Dwayne.
Yeah, I'll make two very different comments. One is just to follow from the previous speaker to say that what I hear a lot from farmers in the U.S. is they're afraid if they don't use the water, they'll lose the right. And that's a huge disincentive to make change. But most of the work that I do, or all of the work that I do, is global in developing countries. And one of the big gaps in information on this is what is the capacity of these local institutions and collaborators. Most of the areas where I work, the institutions, whether it's universities, NGOs, local communities, they don't have the capacity to collect data. And they're not set up to in the future even have that capacity. So for me, one of the big gaps in information here is what is the ability of those local collaborators to contribute and to continue to contribute in the future. And if they lack that capacity, the importance of investing in that.
Great, thank you for their thoughts. Anybody want to elaborate on that or add? I think we'll probably have to move on to the next question after this.
If that's okay. A couple of interesting points there. First of all, if you don't use it, you lose it. That mentality's just got to change, plain and simple. Bring Maria Montessori into the room and have her teach empathy. My other issue is taking a look at the aquifers. Case in point, in Bakersfield, California, there is the Kern Water Bank Authority. It was put together by the Resnicks, largest producers of almonds and pistachios in the world. But 30 years ago, they realized that if they built the infrastructure and pulled off water during the wet years off the canal, they could percolate it down in 20,000 acres. Last year alone, during the California drought, the municipalities that participated in that program saved over $200 million in water costs. And that was basically recharging something that was there, but the infrastructure was never put in place. So I'm a big believer in Jack and Laura Dangerman, who started ESRI, ESRI, and it's about GIS. If you don't map it, if you don't know the source, you're going to be flying blind. So the fine folks over there at the Nature Conservancy got a significant gift by Jack and Laura Dangerman a few years ago. It was 25,000 acres north of Santa Barbara that has a massive aquifer underneath it that shares with the military base next door. But understanding what you have so you know where the fuel gauge is on your life, sharing that information in the most simplistic form with simple details so that everybody knows what you're drawing from. So please look to the Nature Conservancy, look to Jack and Laura Dangerman and ESRI, and bring those tools into your conversation.
All right, thank you. Okay, so last thing we got for you to do here before moving on is pretty simple. If you could go into Mentimeter and just enter 1 to 3 words on how you would describe this activity. We'll give this just a couple minutes and then continue on. You can keep populating that. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Tom and leave some space here for final thoughts and question and answer.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, everybody. We have a few minutes now for a question and answer. Obviously, we've been having a good discussion throughout the exercise, but we do want to put it back to the group and bring some questions back to our panel and continue the discussion. So is there anyone who would like to pose a comment or question? I do have a few if the audience is hesitant, but I'm hoping that there will be some questions or comments that we can put back to the panel and continue the discussion. Great, we've got a couple.
Without having the time to go into the detail, could you provide any insights into the comparison between the South Africa exercise and the Nebraska exercise? You know, what was similar, what was different, what worked where?
So it's a good question. We didn't have time to actually get into a few more of the Mentimeter prompts. But the idea was that, you know, we're trying to get information about the South Africa context, but like we don't have it in-house, right? And we don't have points of contact. And so we need to reach out to them. We need to figure it out. We need to talk to Cargill to figure out if they have it. And so it's another layer of uncertainty. And so that was, you know, if we'd had a little bit more time, we could have gotten into the fact that, you know, that local expertise is really important, but you don't always have access to it. And so how do you make a decision given those gaps, knowing that maybe some folks in the room felt like, you know, Nebraska's fine, let's focus on South Africa, but without that local context, what's next? That was going to be one of our take-homes. So I'm glad you picked up on it. I'm sorry we didn't have time to dig in, though.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, Hannah, for expressing everything that you did here. It was a lot in this presentation. But one thing I did not get was the mathematics behind it. Now, you haven't provided any single sort of mathematical problems, but in reality, it is a math problem. We're talking about supply and demand. We're talking about the amount of water you have in a river basin, but you do not mention anything like that. Have you done anything in the river basin where you have extreme water scarcity, like you have in South Africa and around Cape Town with Day Zero? Like, can you explain some of those aspects on that, please?
I can't explain them in depth because I'm not a modeler or mathematician. There are some folks in the room who might be able to, like Dr. Trenton Franz back there might be able to answer some of the more technical questions, and Justin Gibson sitting next to him. I would say I'm an ecologist by training. My specialty is in social ecological systems. So what I do is I go and I talk to the experts who understand the models. So there are models that they use in central Nebraska to figure out the ground and surface water connection, to figure out groundwater. And we talk to them and we basically do expert elicitation with them as well. So there is, like you said, there's quite a bit of mathematics that go into this, both from sort of the corporate procurement decision, from the modeling perspective. I also argue that a lot of farmers use mathematics to make their own decisions. It's just not my area of expertise, and so I have to like elicit their version that I can understand from them. So it's a good point, but it's just not something where I have expertise. Hopefully that partially addresses your question.
I got a question before Taryn. I hope I say that name right. Or Hannah. You know, it goes back to the data. So I mean, whether it be a potato chip, a soybean, a gallon of milk, or a hamburger, you know, how do you, and it's almost impossible, but how do you influence somebody that you have an indirect influence over? So, you know, you have to, the data gap again, how do you track that data? You know, it could be in an ear tag, or it could go back to the producer doing feed sorghum, going to the dairy. I'm just using that as an example because that's what I know best. You know, how do you protect our data, the producer's data, but then how do you incentivize them? And, you know, then when does he get that incentive? I'm saying, you know, it's complicated, but on the adoption, I mean, I always thought maybe it could be done at the FSA office where we certify the crops, but, you know, that data is private. But so say you provide McDonald's, say, I'm just using hypothetical, a hamburger patty. What's in it for Mickey D's, what's in it for Cargill, what's in it through the whole supply chain to pay the producer back either for conserving water or carbon? You know, data, how do we, I went way too long, I'm sorry. I get in the weeds, but it goes back to data. How do we close the gap? How do we incentivize the producer? How do we track that data?
So I would say there's a couple of questions in there around data overall. I mean, from data that can inform, you know, the setting of your strategy or your goals. That's why it's so useful to have global data sets and tools like Aqueduct and the suite of, you know, tools available under that, because you can have at least a confidence in it helping you to assess your risk, helping you to do that prioritization. I know from the case study that Hannah mentioned, the one that we did with WRI, actually one of the conclusions from that process was that in the absence of perfect data, it's kind of following an 80-20 rule. Like, how can you make the best decisions on the available data? When it comes to thinking about how you use that data to then support the supply chain, I guess there's many ways that we can think about it. Are there programs that we can design that do bring incentives to farmers? Is there programs we can design to support, you know, collaborations like we have with organizations like TNC to build programs that are supporting, you know, a collective group of producers? Sort of coming back to some of that feedback that Hannah was talking about in her case study, you know, farmers still need the information. They want to be able to access, you know, the resources, the messaging that supports them to make that adoption. So I guess I think we see it in multiple ways, and how you can build interventions and programs around that.
I have so many questions. This was super interesting. I guess I'll just start with the Cargill question. So what is the mechanism for Cargill to get benefits back to the producers who are like doing the right thing on the ranch or farm? I think I've heard of some about the carbon markets around ranching for cow-calf or just for ranching operations. And then I have two others questions. Yeah. But the mechanisms are key, I think, to this whole supply chain, you know, to these supply chains. How do the benefits get back to the producer?
Yeah, and we have a program called Region Connect in the US, which is doing some of that, helping to connect farmers to a carbon market. We also then have programs like our Beef Up Sustainability Initiative, which is more kind of bringing a collaborative set of partners together to do more of the how can we help bring good information and training and other resources to producers to make various changes. So I guess I think we're thinking about it across multiple different pathways that we can do it. Kind of and responding to some of the things that we hear from those case studies. I mean, it kind of goes back to my earlier point. How can we best design and develop initiatives that are, meeting those producers and farmers where they are and really ensuring that we are partnering with farmers to support that adoption.
Yeah,
but I could send you some more
that's great.
information
Yeah, I think
as well.
I met with some Beef Up folks. I guess I'm still unclear. Yeah, I'm still learning all the time. It seems like there's programs for learning and for feeling like producers are like doing the right thing, but then we're learning that millennials and other consumers will pay more for a green product, although I find the concept of green beef to be not very, appetizing. But we're wondering kind of at the USDA and Agricultural Research Service how that trickles down eventually to the producer and these like kind of stronger mechanisms. So it's great to hear that Cargill is working on that.
And I'll just add, I mean, one of the challenges that we just sort of tackled with this exercise is that Cargill sources from about 5,000 of these basins worldwide. And like what we all heard from you and what we also know is that you need that top-down sort of like global ability to compare, but you also need to build bespoke programs for the specific conditions. How do you do that for 5,000 basins worldwide?
Yeah.
And so like we see these programs like Taryn was mentioning, like the Sustainability Connect, Regen Connect and Beef Up, and they're amazing programs, but if you build a program for one place, it might not translate to others. And so like this is one of the big challenges of scale, right? It's like the closer you look, the more detail you see, and that detail matters.
Yeah.
And so that's like what we're trying to do here. This is more for water. Like I think you're talking a little bit maybe more in like the grassland carbon climate context, but the same sort of challenge applies to both. And it's like that's what we're trying to figure out. Like Cargill internally, they come to TNC and others and they say like, what do we do? Right? And we say need something that's locally specific and globally relevant. And that's like the exercise we just went through.
Yeah, I am talking about that. I think that'll be an early example though, like kind of all this attention around carbon and carbon markets and eventually, selling or some of those same mechanisms maybe could be helpful for farmers doing the right thing for like water or nutrient management. Maybe, but I wax poetic. But so my question was about the expert elicitation. So who are the experts? How do you make sure you have everybody at the table who you want or who should be at the table? I guess
that's a really important question. Right now, we have to balance efficiency with scalability, and so like we can't go and interview every single person in local conditions, but what you can do is you can have general algorithms. Like first, see if there's experts within the company who know about the local region. If you're in a region with weak governance controls, make sure you have local communities, make sure you have indigenous communities, and make sure that you have all the relevant safeguards when you are working with those more marginalized communities. That might not matter as much in a place like Nebraska as it would like the Cerrado region in Brazil, right? And so like part of like this exercise and this project with Cargill is at the end we're going to have those very specific recommendations that are place specific to make sure that you sort of have a narrow enough group of experts that you're going to elicit that information from to like be efficient and get the information you need without inadvertently leaving out really important voices. And so there's a lot of ethics involved. There's a lot of efficiency that's involved as well. So it's a really important question.
cool. And so I heard algorithm too. So that'll be set up. You're setting that up.
Yeah, I mean, it's just gonna be like a flow chart.
Cool.
So algorithm, flow chart, method.
That's great. Okay, final question. And that is about the Aqueduct database. I was wondering if that integrates like ideas of telecoupling, like where the water's coming from and how different basins might be affected by each other's management or dynamics.
Not right now. At least that's what they're currently doing. I don't know if they would be able to build a model that complex for
Sure.
the global scale,
Yeah.
maybe. But that's again where expert elicitation can be really important. So some of the questions that we didn't show here are like, what are the hydrological features of your basin? Because there are even places in Nebraska where if you have farmers become more quote unquote efficient and apply less water to their fields, that water historically came from the ground, went to their fields, and then made its way to the river. And so when they pump less water from the ground, the river dries up. Right? In other places, you might have the opposite effect, right? Where if farmers are drawing from the surface and they take less, maybe you're going to see more in-stream flows. And that's just in Nebraska, right? So that level of specificity that you would need to make good decisions, I don't know that would make it into a model like Aqueduct. But again, that's where like that expert elicitation is super essential
Yeah.
about the hydrology.
Seems like it. Okay, thank you very much. That was excellent. Thanks.
Thanks for the questions. We got a few more over here. We've got about 10 minutes left. A little less than that. I saw your hand first, and then we'll go to Nick.
Great, thank you. Jacob, this question's for you. So you've been working with farmers, 10 years on various different projects. I guess how is your opinion or kind of your experience of how farmers have adopted technology? Are their opinions changing towards that? I know we worked with soil moisture probes and some of those challenges. I guess could you talk about that or remote sensing and modeling kind of as it pertains to irrigation? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I think that what Dr. Franz is referring to, we've done some work through the years with irrigation, with farmers, specifically with trying to promote technologies for helping them better manage their water. And that for sure has been an interesting conversation with farmers through the years. There's a lot of sit-downs on the early end of those relationships where there's a lot of mistrust or misunderstanding or skepticism. I think the model we've taken and many other folks have taken is trying to get there and give a low-risk opportunity for them to try these things out where they don't necessarily have those same sorts of objectives to lean into. If they're getting some financial incentives, then the bottom line isn't as big of a pushback. If they're getting technical assistance, then saying they don't know how to do these things is harder to push back as well too. And so I think what we've found is that if you create those enabling conditions with the farmers and get them that opportunity to try these things out, we've seen a lot of success with once you get over that initial hurdle and they try out these tools or try out these practices in general, that you'll see them see the value, understand the value, and for the most part, take it and expand it across their operation once they've kind of jumped through those mental gymnastics of justifying the value of those tools and those practices on their operation.
I'm going to jump in. So I've got 2 comments and then a question, which is actually for all 4 of you. So first of all, I'd like to commend you on the session. It's really hard to do engaging content, and so both having the Mentimeter and the case study, it's really very much appreciated. My second comment is actually I'd like to point out Cargill's water strategy in that many of the CPG groups, many of the companies actually explicitly exclude farmers and growers and irrigators from their corporate water strategies. And so I also want to commend that Cargill is actually thinking hard about stewardship practices right across its supply chain. That's unusual, and it's also noteworthy. So to come to my question, it's actually for all of you. It's a session on corporate water targets, engagement, cross-sectoral engagement, and how you prioritize. Even within the TNC group here, you wear different hats, you operate differently. And so my question is, what does successful engagement with the corporate sector look like for each of you in turn? If you've succeeded 5 years down the line, what does that look like? And maybe I'll start with Taryn on that, and then go to the TNC side. So thank you very much.
So just so I understand your question, when you say successful engagement, between like NGOs and the corporate sector, or between all?
For you, so you've succeeded in your corporate water strategy and your target. What does that look like for you?
Well, I hope we've contributed to a positive water impact around the world. I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to drive towards. We have a global ambition that we understand the critical resource that water is. So we, by realizing the goals that we've set, we want to make sure that ultimately we're having a positive outcome in those supply chains and communities. That's what we're driving towards.
Well put. And I'll just say, the reason this session was interactive is because Nick asked me to do it about 2 months ago. And about 2 weeks ago, I panicked because I had forgotten that I agreed to do that. So thank you again for bearing with us. This was a little bit by the skin of our teeth, but we pulled it off. So that's yeah, thanks, Nick, for pushing us on that. To me, so I am on our TNC's corporate engagement team. I really hope I'm out of a job. Like, that's ultimately what it is. And what that means is, this has come up a few times, but when I started working for the Nature Conservancy, there was a lot of corporations who said, man, we extract a lot of value from these places. We want to give some value back. We want to do right. We're getting beat up. We're going to set targets. We want to invest in this. And that's great, but that has to be behind us. It has to be about procurement decisions. And so what I mean by that is that when procurement teams think about where they're purchasing grain from, the prices they're paying, the contracts they're creating, social and ecological well-being are baked into those decisions, because we're not going to be able to go watershed by watershed. We're not going to be able to go program by program and get to where we need to go. And ultimately, we're actually seeing companies come around to this idea. Interestingly enough, with the COVID-19 supply chain disruptions and shocks, companies are realizing that it is a competitive disadvantage to not understand your supply base and to not manage it. If you want financing, if you want customers, and if you want to be able to have stable supply chains despite the vagaries of war, pandemics, global climate change, you have to manage your supply chains in a way that takes all of those features into account. And so we're seeing that appetite, and what I'm desperately trying to do every day when I wake up and go to work is figure out a way to make that translation. So again, the companies can own that and really scale it up, and that I'm eventually out of a job.
I'll be relatively brief. I'm more the on-the-ground guy, so I guess I think of things from the farmer, local sort of aspect. And I guess I look at the success on the back end of this thing, and I think what will be there is some sort of win-win. It doesn't have to be the same motivation for everybody that's involved, but I think that there's got to be some sort of solution out there where everybody can be on the same page for what they're doing, maybe not necessarily what they're getting out of it. The farmer's looking at it and it's good for their bottom line, it's good for their productivity, it's good for their quality of life. And at the same time, those changes that make sense to them for their own reason are also generating the outcomes that we want to see as a system, that we want to see up the supply chain as well too. And then just an extra thing that I think is kind of a neat caveat to the work that we've done here in the state through the years is that I talked to lots of farmers that really do appreciate being connected up to the supply chain by being involved there. And so I think that there's a lot of conversations that could be had to kind of enhance that and understand each of those two communities better across each other. So.
Great. Well, in a lot of ways, that was a great closing question or comment. We forced the panelists to give some final reflections on this big topic. I do want to see, is there any closing comments or remarks that people would like to make? Then I would like to thank all of you for joining this session and have a round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you very much.